fluorescent lights in the pediatric emergency room cast a surgical glare across linoleum floors, still damp from the night shift's mopping.
Get out of here!
4:17 in the morning, and
This
Marcus
is
Sullivan
insane!
sat in a plastic chair
The extraction
that had been
point has
engineered
changed.
for
We need to move
discomfort,
now.
watching
Understood.
the
My team is
oxygen
ready. Give me the
saturation
coordinates.
monitor
Transmitting
above
now.
his son's bed climb with agonizing slowness. 87%. 89. The numbers glowed green against black, each incremental rise a small mercy that did nothing to ease the knot in his chest. Jake's small hand felt hot in his. The 8-year-old's fingers curled tight, even in medicated half-sleep. The boy's chest rose and fell with visible effort, each breath a battle against airways that had decided sometime around 3 in the morning to close up like a fist. The nebulizer mask covered half his face, pumping albuterol in steady white clouds that smelled of plastic and desperation. Marcus had been through this dance before, 6 times in the past 18 months, each episode arriving without warning, turning ordinary nights into ambulance rides and emergency room vigils. The doctors called it severe persistent asthma, a condition inherited from Sarah's side of the family, a genetic gift from the woman who'd been dead 5 years, but whose absence still shaped every hour of their lives. The monitor beeped. 92%. Better. Not great, but better. A resident appeared at the bedside, young enough that his white coat still carried sharp creases, old enough to have the exhaustion of a 20-hour shift carved into the skin beneath his eyes. He checked Jake's chart without looking at Marcus, fingers moving across a tablet screen with practiced efficiency. Oxygen levels are stabilizing. We'll keep him another hour for observation, but barring any regression, you should be able to take him home by 7. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. The resident disappeared back into the controlled chaos of the emergency department, leaving father and son alone in the small treatment bay with its thin curtains and persistent beeping. 6:43. Marcus checked his phone. 2 missed calls from Mrs. Martinez, their neighbor, the retired teacher in her 70s who'd known Rebecca and had adopted them both as unofficial family after the funeral. She'd be awake, worried, waiting for word. He typed out a quick text, "Jake's stable. Home soon. Thanks for being ready." The reply came back immediately. "Thank God. I'll have breakfast waiting." Marcus set the phone down and looked at his son. Jake had Sarah's thick dark hair, her habit of asking questions that cut straight to uncomfortable truths. He'd inherited her asthma too, the genetic lottery delivering both gift and curse in a package too small to defend itself against biology's cruelties. The boy's stirred eyes fluttering open behind the nebulizer mask. Recognition came slowly, followed by the familiar fear that always appeared when Jake woke in strange places without immediately seeing his father. Marcus leaned close, bringing his face into Jake's line of sight. "Right here, buddy. You're okay. The medicine's working." The tension left Jake's small body. His fingers tightened around Marcus's hand, a question forming in eyes still glassy with medication. "Hospital," Marcus said, answering the unspoken inquiry. "Your breathing got bad around 3. Ambulance brought us here. Mrs. Martinez is at the house." Jake's gaze drifted to the oxygen monitor, trying to make sense of the numbers. At 8 years old, he'd learned to read the machines better than most adults, a skill no child should need but one that came with chronic illness. 93, Marcus said, watching the display. "You're doing good." The nurse arrived to remove the nebulizer, checking vitals with brisk efficiency before declaring Jake stable enough for discharge. Paperwork followed the administrative machinery of American healthcare, grinding through its paces, while Marcus signed forms and nodded at discharge instructions he'd memorized months ago. By 7:15, they were in Marcus's truck. Jake buckled into the back seat with the emergency inhaler within reach and instructions to use it at the first sign of tightness. The Houston morning had already climbed into the 80s, humidity thick enough to feel solid against skin. Traffic was building on the interstate, the city's daily migration toward downtown jobs and suburban schools beginning in earnest. Mrs. Martinez met them at the door of the small rental house in Kingwood, a neighborhood that had seen better decades, but still maintained the kind of quiet dignity that came with working families who took care of their properties. She had coffee-ready eggs, scrambled toast cut into triangles the way Jake preferred. Her dark eyes swept over the boy with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent 40 years teaching elementary school. "Breathing okay?" Jake nodded, already gravitating toward the couch and the stack of library books about space exploration that he'd been working through all week. "He'll sleep most of the morning," Marcus said, accepting the coffee she pressed into his hands. "The medication always knocks him out." Mrs. Martinez glanced at the kitchen clock. 7:42. "You need to be at work at 9, yes?" The question landed like a punch. Marcus had forgotten the night's crisis, pushing everything else into a fog of irrelevance. Whitstone Aerospace. His shift started at 9, and the new CEO had made it abundantly clear that tardiness would not be tolerated under any circumstances. "I can stay with him," Mrs. Martinez continued. "He knows me. He'll be comfortable." Marcus looked at Jake, already half asleep against the couch cushions, and felt the familiar calculation begin. Call in sick and risk his job, or go to work and trust that Jake's breathing would hold steady. The math had been simple when he'd left the Navy 5 years ago, trading a career he'd loved for work that offered stability and flexibility. Except the flexibility had disappeared 6 months ago when Catherine Price took over as CEO and implemented policies designed to squeeze every drop of efficiency from the workforce. "I'll file emergency leave through the system," he said, pulling out his phone. "Should take 5 minutes to get approved." Except the system Catherine had installed required 3 levels of managerial approval before emergency requests processed. Marcus watched the digital form submit, watched it enter a queue, watched it sit there unchanged while precious minutes ticked past. At 8:15, he called his direct supervisor, got voicemail, left a message explaining the situation. At 8:30, he tried again with the same result. 8:45. Mrs. Martinez refilled his coffee without comment, her silence more eloquent than any advice. "I have to go," Marcus heard himself say. "If I don't show up, I'm done. And without the insurance—" He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what came after Jake's medication cost more than Marcus's rent, and losing the job meant losing the health coverage that stood between his son and catastrophe. Mrs. Martinez nodded. "I'll watch him like he's my own. You have my number. I'll call if anything changes." Marcus kissed Jake's forehead, whispered the same promise he'd made every day since Rebecca died. "I'll always come back for you, buddy. Always." The drive to Whitstone took 23 minutes, traffic heavier than usual, construction on the Hardy Toll Road, forcing everything into 2 lanes that moved with geological patience. Marcus arrived at 9:07, 3 minutes past the start of his shift, and found Catherine Price standing in the doorway of the maintenance floor like a sentry guarding the gates of employment. She was 45, but could have passed for younger, her dark suit tailored with precision, her expression carrying the temperature of polished steel. 6 months ago, the board had hired her to fix Whitstone's bleeding finances, and she'd attacked the task with the enthusiasm of someone who measured worth in quarterly earnings and viewed human beings as variables in efficiency equations. "Mr. Sullivan." Her voice cut through the ambient noise of the hangar floor, silencing conversation, stopping work. 14 technicians and supervisors froze at their stations, unwilling to witness what they couldn't prevent. Marcus stopped 3 feet from her, exhausted, still smelling of hospital antiseptic and fear. "Ms. Price, I apologize for being late. My son had a medical emergency. I filed for emergency leave, but the approval system—" "You are late." Catherine's words landed like a gavel. 7 minutes past your shift start. This company operates on precision, not sentiment. Your emergency, whatever it was, has no bearing on our contract obligations to the Department of Defense. The unfairness of it hit Marcus like a physical blow. But he'd spent 14 years in the Navy learning when to fight and when to accept the chain of command's decisions. He nodded once, jaw tight, and reached for the security badge clipped to his chest. The small rectangle of plastic separated from the lanyard with a quiet click. Marcus set it on the desk between them, the gesture precise and final. He didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply turned toward the door, the hangar floor stretching before him like a walk of shame he'd never earned. Behind him, 12 technicians and 2 supervisors stood frozen, their eyes trained on computer screens and inventory sheets, pretending not to see what they lacked the power to stop. Marcus had crossed half the distance to the glass double doors when the sky outside began to vibrate. The sound started low, a bass rumble that climbed into frequencies that rattled teeth. Concrete trembled beneath boot soles. Loose papers on desks lifted and swirled through the floor-to-ceiling windows as if caught in a localized tornado. A massive Navy Seahawk helicopter descended in a brutal vertical drop, rotors slicing the humid Texas air into a blinding storm of dust and gravel. It touched down hard on the executive parking lot, the skids kissing asphalt with a metallic scream that silenced every conversation in the building. The side door slid open before the rotors began to spool down. A man in crisp Navy fatigues dropped to the tarmac and sprinted toward the hangar, his boots pounding a rhythm of absolute urgency. Lieutenant Commander David Hayes moved like a missile locked on target, ignoring the Whitstone security guards who scrambled toward him with radios pressed to their mouths and confusion written across their faces. He was 42, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that came from 2 decades of high-stakes decisions made in fractions of seconds. Catherine Price stood in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, her mind struggling to reconcile the impossible scene unfolding 30 yards away. The rotor wash hit her like a physical wall, whipping her tailored blazer against her ribs. She stepped forward, rebuilding her composure from the ground up, raising her voice against the fading thunder of the helicopter. "Commander, this is private property. You cannot land military aircraft here without clearance. I demand an explanation for this intrusion and the name of whoever authorized it." Hayes stopped 3 feet from her. He produced a laminated card from his breast pocket and held it up for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for her to see the Department of Defense seal and the words "Priority Authority" before letting it drop back into place. His eyes never left the crowd of faces behind her. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Commander David Hayes, U.S. Navy Search and Rescue Coordination. I have priority clearance from the Joint Chiefs to extract essential personnel in a life-critical scenario. This facility is now temporarily under naval jurisdiction. I need the whereabouts of Marcus Sullivan. Immediately." Catherine felt the ground tilt beneath her expensive heels. The name hit her like a fist to the sternum. Marcus Sullivan, the low-level maintenance technician she'd just fired for being 7 minutes late. "There must be some confusion, Commander. That man was just terminated. He's a low-level maintenance technician, nothing more." She repeated the words with the deliberate weight of someone trying to make reality conform to their understanding of it. Hayes didn't blink. He stared at her with an expression that combined surgical precision and professional contempt in equal measure, the kind of look reserved for obstacles that refuse to recognize their own irrelevance. A low-level technician. The words came out flat, each syllable weighted with disbelief and something close to disgust. Hayes shifted his stance, planting his boots. "Ma'am, you just demonstrated a profound failure to assess the personnel under your command. That technician is the single most critical asset in a national security emergency involving hardware your company manufactured. The lives of 4 highly trained naval officers are currently hanging on his specialized knowledge, which you clearly never bothered to evaluate." He leaned forward, dropping his voice to a register that carried more menace than any shout. "So let me be perfectly clear, Madam CEO, you just fired the only man on this entire coast who can save a flight crew currently 30 miles offshore, and you just attempted to obstruct a military recovery operation authorized at the highest levels of the Department of Defense." Catherine staggered back half a step. The entire administrative floor had gone silent. Supervisors, managers, technicians, everyone who'd watched Marcus Sullivan walk away 2 minutes earlier, now stood frozen in a tableau of dawning horror. The air tasted like copper and shame. A mid-level manager named Derek Paulson broke from the crowd, his face slick with sweat, a tablet clutched in trembling hands. He pushed through to Catherine's side and began reading from an emergency alert that had just populated his secure inbox. "Ma'am, it's a Navy T-45 training jet. Catastrophic anomaly in the secondary flight control system. Code lock. They're running on minimal power and losing hydraulic pressure, too far out for safe water landing. His voice cracked. He looked up from the screen, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from understanding the stakes. Standard protocols are failing. The alert specifically names one civilian expert who successfully mitigated this exact system failure during a classified simulation exercise 6 years ago. Paulson's throat worked. The expert is listed as Marcus Sullivan. Catherine's mind fractured. She looked back toward the hangar entrance, toward the empty space where the low-level technician had been standing moments before. The man she'd dismissed for being 60 seconds past the arbitrary threshold of punctuality. The impossible truth slammed into her with the force of a freight train. The quiet maintenance worker in the faded uniform was a secret weapon, a forgotten genius linked to black operations and national security infrastructure she couldn't begin to comprehend. Marcus had heard the commotion. The helicopter's arrival was impossible to miss, and the specific query for his name carried through the open hangar doors with crystalline clarity. He reappeared at the edge of the tarmac, still wearing the blue uniform that marked him as a recently terminated employee of Whitstone Aerospace. Commander Hayes spotted him instantly. The Navy officer executed a sharp salute, the kind rendered between peers who recognized each other's capability across the divide of rank and circumstance. Marcus Sullivan, by pure instinct, returned the gesture. The movement was crisp, exact, profoundly military, the reflex of a man who'd spent years in service to something larger than himself. In that single flawless motion, Catherine Price recognized the caliber of the man she'd just discarded like faulty equipment. Hayes dropped the formality and closed the distance between them. "Mr. Sullivan, you know the protocol. They're losing the secondary loop. Can you work the mitigation remotely from the aircraft?" Marcus ignored Catherine. He ignored the stunned crowd of his former colleagues. He ignored the news cameras that were already swarming the perimeter fence drawn by the spectacle of a military helicopter landing at a civilian defense contractor. His focus had already traveled 30 miles out over the Gulf of Mexico into the cramped cockpit of a dying aircraft where 4 men fought against physics and failing systems. His only question came out calm, precise, entirely professional. "Are there confirmed injuries?" "Negative," Hayes replied, his tone shifting to match Marcus's controlled urgency. "But they're approaching critical parameters. Experiencing wild control surface oscillations. Fuel is limited. We're out of time." Marcus nodded. He didn't ask for his job back. He didn't request a security badge or an apology or permission to re-enter the building he'd been escorted out of 2 minutes prior. He simply moved with a sudden, devastating efficiency that belonged to an entirely different world than the one Catherine Price inhabited. Hayes threw open the Seahawk's side door. Marcus tossed his worn backpack onto the tarmac and climbed into the helicopter. The blue maintenance uniform a strange contrast against the gray military steel surrounding him. The rotors began to spin up again, the sound building from a whine into a deafening roar that drowned out every other noise on the flight line. Catherine could only stand there, pale and shaken, as the man she had fired was claimed by the United States Navy to save lives she hadn't known were at risk. The helicopter lifted off in a tornado of dust and noise, banking hard to the southeast. Catherine stood on the ground holding Marcus Sullivan's discarded employee badge, the plastic rectangle still warm from his body heat, and felt the foundation of her understanding crack apart beneath her feet. She turned and walked back into the building, ignoring the stares of the employees who had witnessed the entire exchange. Her heels clicked against the polished concrete floor of the administrative wing, each step carrying her toward an office that suddenly felt less like a position of power and more like a cage she'd built from her own arrogance. Catherine reached her corner office and locked the door behind her, then sat down at her desk and pulled up Marcus Sullivan's complete personnel file on her computer. The document that loaded onto her screen was not the profile of a low-level maintenance technician. Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Sullivan, Lead Systems Engineer, Pacific Fleet Aviation, 14 years of service. Commendations for technical innovation in diagnostic software architecture. direct contributor to the development of fly-by-wire control systems for carrier-based aircraft, including the T-45 Goshawk trainer currently used by the Navy for advanced jet pilot instruction. Recipient of the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, a non-combat decoration for heroism awarded for technical decisions made during a high-risk aerial rescue operation in the Persian Gulf. Catherine scrolled down. The file included a promotion offer, a direct commission to lieutenant commander, contingent on his agreement to accept a shore-based assignment at Naval Air Systems Command in Patuxent River, Maryland. Marcus had declined. The discharge paperwork cited personal circumstances requiring immediate family care as the reason for separation. No details, no elaboration, just a bureaucratic phrase that concealed an entire universe of pain. She kept reading. Marcus's technical expertise wasn't limited to diagnostics. He had been instrumental in identifying a critical flaw in the secondary flight control system of the T-45 during the aircraft's initial integration testing 6 years ago. The flaw involved a handoff sequence between the primary fly-by-wire system and the manual override backup, a narrow window during high-G maneuvers where the control surfaces could freeze momentarily if the software encountered a specific sequence of inputs. Marcus had flagged the issue in a formal report submitted while he was still on active duty. He had recommended a complete redesign of the affected module, a fix that would have required 6 months of development work and delayed the aircraft's deployment by a full fiscal year. Whitstone's executive team at the time, the previous CEO and his leadership council, had rejected the recommendation. They had been 3 months away from delivering the contract and collecting a substantial performance bonus tied to on-time completion. Instead of redesigning the module, they had implemented a software patch that masked the error by rerouting the diagnostic alert into a dummy variable. The system appeared to function correctly during controlled testing, but the underlying flaw remained embedded in the code like a ticking bomb. Catherine's hands began to tremble. She scrolled further, pulling up the internal communications chain tied to Marcus's original report. The emails were clinical and devastating. Marcus had escalated the issue twice while still in the Navy, providing detailed simulations that demonstrated the failure mode under real-world stress conditions. The response from Whitstone's program director had been terse. Cost-benefit analysis does not support delay. Implement workaround and document for post-delivery review. The post-delivery review had never happened. The documentation had been buried in a server archive. The T-45 aircraft equipped with the flawed modules had been delivered to the Navy and integrated into the training fleet. And Marcus Sullivan, the engineer who had tried to prevent the disaster, had left the Navy 6 months later when his wife died, eventually taking a job at Whitstone as a low-level technician working in anonymity at the very company that had ignored his warnings. Catherine closed the file and sat in silence. The implications crashed over her in waves. If the aircraft currently in distress over the Gulf of Mexico went down, it wouldn't be an accident. It would be corporate negligence bordering on manslaughter. Whitstone had knowingly delivered defective systems to the military, systems that Marcus had warned them about in writing, and they had silenced his concerns with a $50 patch and a bureaucratic dismissal. And she, Catherine Price, had just fired the one man who knew how to fix it. Her phone began to ring. The caller ID showed the Whitstone board chairman's direct line. She let it go to voicemail. Another call came in immediately, this one from the company's general counsel, then another from the VP of government contracts. Catherine ignored them all. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the tarmac where the Seahawk had landed 15 minutes earlier. The rotor wash had scattered papers across the parking lot. Security guards were still standing in confused clusters, radios in hand, waiting for orders that wouldn't come. A news van had pulled up to the perimeter gate, its satellite dish already extending toward the sky. This was going to be national news within the hour. Military helicopter landing at defense contractor. Emergency extraction of fired employee. The story would write itself, and every word would paint Whitstone as either criminally negligent or catastrophically incompetent. Catherine picked up her phone and dialed Marcus Sullivan's cell number from his personnel file. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His voice on the recording was calm and unremarkable. "You've reached Marcus Sullivan. Leave a message." She ended the call without speaking. What could she possibly say? "I'm sorry I fired you for trying to save your son's life. I'm sorry I didn't bother to read your file before destroying your livelihood. I'm sorry I'm complicit in a cover-up that might kill 4 men." The words felt grotesquely insufficient. Catherine opened her email and began drafting a message to the board of directors. She wrote 3 sentences, deleted them, and started over. The truth was simple, but the consequences were apocalyptic. Whitstone had lied to the Department of Defense. They had falsified safety reports. They had ignored warnings from their own engineer, an engineer who'd been serving his country at the time, and buried evidence of a critical flaw that was now manifesting exactly as Marcus had predicted it would. If Catherine disclosed the truth, the company would face criminal prosecution, billions in liability, and the permanent loss of every government contract that kept them solvent. If she stayed silent and the aircraft went down, the investigation would uncover the cover-up anyway, and she would go to prison alongside the executives who had made the original decision. She had one narrow path forward: tell the truth, take full responsibility, and pray that Marcus Sullivan could save the 4 pilots before the political fallout arrived. Catherine saved the draft email and stood up. She walked out of her office, through the administrative bullpen where every employee pretended not to watch her, and down the corridor to the conference room where the executive team was undoubtedly gathering to discuss crisis management strategies. She pushed open the door without knocking. 8 senior leaders sat around the table: CFO Thomas Brennan, COO David Park, General Counsel Margaret Keene, and 5 VPS responsible for everything from government relations to supply chain logistics. They all turned to look at her. Brennan spoke first, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Catherine, what the hell just happened out there? We have the Navy landing helicopters on our property and the media is already running footage. I need to know—" Catherine cut him off. "We have a T-45 in distress over the Gulf, secondary flight control failure, the exact failure mode that Marcus Sullivan reported 6 years ago when he was still serving in the Navy. The failure we covered up with a software patch instead of fixing properly." The room went silent. Margaret Keene, the general counsel, closed her eyes and exhaled slowly through her nose. "Tell me you're joking." "I'm not." Marcus identified the flaw during his active duty service and filed a formal report through the contractor liaison channel. He recommended a full redesign. The previous executive team rejected it to avoid delaying the contract. They implemented a workaround that masked the error without fixing it. The documentation is in the archives. Brennan's face went from pale to crimson. "That was before your time, Catherine. You can't be held responsible for decisions made by people who aren't even here anymore." "I'm responsible for what happens next," Catherine replied. "We have 47 aircraft in the active fleet with this system installed. If we don't disclose the flaw immediately, we're complicit in whatever happens to those crews." David Park leaned back in his chair, his expression calculating. "If we disclose, we're admitting liability for a defect that could have killed people. The lawsuits alone will bankrupt us. The DoD will pull every contract. We'll be done. If we don't disclose and someone dies, we'll face criminal charges for obstruction and conspiracy," Margaret Keene said quietly. "There's no good option here, only bad and worse." Catherine looked at each of them in turn. "I'm issuing a voluntary safety recall of all T-45 modules effective immediately. I'm cooperating fully with the Navy's investigation, and I'm disclosing the existence of Marcus Sullivan's original report and the decision to implement a patch instead of a fix." Thomas Brennan slammed his hand on the table. "You'll destroy this company." "I'll save what can be saved," Catherine said. "Our reputation, our integrity, maybe our freedom. But I won't sit here and watch 4 men die because we were too cowardly to admit we screwed up." She turned and walked out of the conference room before anyone could argue further. Behind her she heard the eruption of voices, some angry, some resigned, all trapped in the same impossible calculation of risk and consequence. Catherine returned to her office and opened her laptop. She pulled up the legal compliance portal and began drafting the formal disclosure notice that would go to the Department of Defense, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the Naval Air Systems Command. The document outlined the history of Marcus Sullivan's original report from his time in active service, the decision to implement a workaround, and the current emergency situation that had exposed the flaw's continued existence in the fleet. She wrote carefully, precisely, knowing that every word would be scrutinized by prosecutors and plaintiffs' attorneys. When she finished, she attached Marcus's original technical report and the email chain showing the executive team's decision to override his recommendation. Then she clicked send. The email disappeared into the ether. Catherine sat back in her chair and felt the weight of what she'd just done settle onto her shoulders like a yoke. In the next 72 hours, Whitstone's stock price would collapse. Shareholders would file suit. The board would likely move to remove her. The DoD would launch a formal investigation that could result in criminal charges for the executives who had made the original decision to cover up the flaw. But 4 pilots might live, and Marcus Sullivan, the man she had fired for being 7 minutes late, would be the one who saved them. Catherine picked up her phone and tried his number again. This time it didn't even ring. The call went straight to voicemail. Marcus was already in the air, already focused on the only thing that mattered, bringing those men home. She ended the call and whispered to the empty office, "I'm sorry, Marcus, for all of it." The words felt hollow. Apologies didn't undo damage. They didn't restore trust or repair the consequences of casual cruelty. But they were all she had. Catherine stood and walked to the window one more time. The sky to the southeast was clear and blue, empty of helicopters. Somewhere out there over the dark water of the Gulf, Marcus Sullivan was doing what he had always done, solving impossible problems under impossible pressure because someone's life depended on it. And she, Catherine Price, was left to confront the wreckage of her own certainty. The Seahawk's cabin smelled of hydraulic fluid and salt air. Marcus strapped into the jump seat and pulled the Navy-issue headset over his ears, fingers moving through the familiar ritual without conscious thought. Commander Hayes handed him a ruggedized laptop already displaying telemetry data from the T-45 numbers scrolling in real time across a black screen edged with crimson warning indicators. Marcus's eyes tracked the cascade of failing parameters with the cold precision of a surgeon reading vitals during a code blue. The jet was dying slowly, incrementally, but dying nonetheless. Altitude held steady at 9,000 feet, but the control surface oscillations were growing worse with each passing minute. The pilots were fighting a stick that responded like a living thing trying to shake them loose. Hydraulic pressure in the secondary system had dropped below minimum operational threshold. The aircraft was eating through its emergency reserves, compensating for failures faster than the backup systems could adapt. Marcus pulled up the diagnostic overlay and felt his stomach tighten. The signature was unmistakable, the exact failure mode he had documented 6 years ago in a report that Whitstone's executives had ignored. The primary fly-by-wire system was attempting to hand control to the manual override during a routine training maneuver. But the handoff sequence contained a ghost in the code, a fractional delay barely measurable under normal conditions that multiplied into catastrophic oscillation when the aircraft pulled high G turns. He had warned them. He had shown them the simulations. He had outlined the fix in painstaking detail, and they had chosen profit over safety deadlines, over lives patching the symptom instead of curing the disease. Hayes leaned over his shoulder, voice crackling through the headset. "What are we looking at, Sullivan?" "Code lock in the secondary control loop. The system's trying to correct a drift that doesn't exist, overcorrecting every input the pilots make. It's a feedback spiral. The more they fight it, the worse it gets. Can you break it from here?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the module's source code, searching for the specific subroutine that governed the handoff protocol. The screen filled with lines of text commands and conditionals and nested loops that represented thousands of hours of engineering labor. Somewhere in that digital architecture was the flaw, the hairline fracture that had widened into a chasm. He found it. Line 2847, a variable assignment that routed error data into a dummy placeholder instead of triggering the fail-safe shutdown. The $50 patch, elegant in its simplicity and catastrophic in its consequences. I can bypass it, but I need direct comms with the pilots. No relay, no delay. If the timing's off by even 2 seconds, we lose them. Hayes keyed his radio. Corpus Christi Tower, this is Navy Seahawk 7. I need priority channel to T-45 call sign Red Hawk 3. Patch us through on secure frequency. Authentication code Delta Whiskey 97. The response came back in less than 5 seconds, the tower controller's voice tight with controlled urgency. Hawk 7, you're patched. Red Hawk 3 is on channel. Marcus adjusted his headset and spoke directly into the pilot's ears. Red Hawk 3, this is civilian consultant Sullivan. I designed the diagnostic protocols for your flight control system. I know what's wrong and I know how to fix it. I need you to listen very carefully and do exactly what I tell you exactly when I tell you. No improvisation, no second guessing. Acknowledge. A voice came back young and strained, fighting to keep panic out of the syllables. Sullivan, this is Lieutenant Ryan Torres, Red Hawk 3 lead. We acknowledge. Standing by for instructions. Marcus pulled up the telemetry again. The aircraft had 8 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption rates, less if the pilots kept fighting the oscillations. He needed to force a system reset that would dump the corrupted handoff sequence and reboot the secondary controls into manual mode. The procedure required the pilots to execute a series of commands that would momentarily surrender all automated stability assistance, leaving them flying a $5 million jet trainer with nothing but raw stick input and throttle control. In smooth air, it would be challenging. In the middle of a control surface oscillation, it would be suicidal. Red Hawk 3. I'm going to walk you through a forced reboot of your secondary flight control module. It requires you to disengage all automated systems for approximately 15 seconds. During that window, you'll have full manual authority but zero computer assistance. You'll be hand-flying the aircraft with no stability augmentation. Do you understand what that means? There was a pause. Marcus could hear the background noise of the cockpit, the whine of the engines, the rattle of something loose in the airframe. The breathing of 4 men who understood they were one mistake away from ejecting into the Gulf. Understood, Sullivan. We're ready. All right. First step, I need you to input bypass code 4 Delta 9 Alpha into your flight control diagnostic panel. That will unlock the manual override subsystem. Marcus waited, watching the telemetry feed. The code would take approximately 10 seconds to execute if the pilots entered it correctly. He counted silently, watching the seconds tick by on the mission clock displayed in the corner of the laptop screen. The data stream flickered. For a moment the telemetry went dark, then snapped back online with a new status indicator flashing green. The bypass code had been accepted, but the oscillations didn't stop. Marcus felt ice slide down his spine. The code should have worked. It had worked in every simulation he'd run during the original testing phase. The system should have recognized the bypass command and dumped the corrupted handoff routine, clearing the way for a clean manual takeover. Instead, the oscillations intensified. The T-45 dropped 500 feet in 8 seconds, the altitude readout bleeding red as the pilots hauled back on the stick to arrest the descent. Lieutenant Torres's voice came through the headset, no longer calm, the professional veneer cracking under the pressure of imminent death. Sullivan, it's not working. We're losing altitude fast. The surfaces are going crazy. Hayes gripped Marcus's shoulder. What the hell happened? Marcus stared at the screen, mind racing through possibilities. The bypass code had executed correctly. The system logs confirmed it. But the oscillations were worse, not better, which meant the corrupted handoff routine wasn't just present in the original code. It had propagated into the backup systems, spreading like a virus through every redundant layer of the flight control architecture. Whitstone hadn't just patched the symptom, they'd allowed the infection to metastasize. They modified the code after I left the Navy. Marcus heard himself say the words coming out flat and cold. The patch I designed was meant for the original system architecture, but they kept tweaking it, optimizing for performance metrics without understanding what they were breaking. He pulled up a secondary diagnostic window and began stripping away layers of code, searching for the new insertion points where the corrupted routine had embedded itself. The T-45 was at 7,800 feet now, descending through a hard deck that would leave the pilots no margin for error. They had maybe 90 seconds before the decision tree collapsed to a single option: eject and pray the rescue swimmers reached them before hypothermia set in. Marcus found the secondary corruption buried 3 levels deep in a subroutine that governed emergency throttle response. Some engineer following orders to squeeze another 0.5% of efficiency out of the system had duplicated the handoff logic and tied it to the engine management protocol. The fix wasn't as simple as a bypass code anymore. It required a complete manual override of both flight controls and propulsion systems simultaneously. Red Hawk 3, listen to me. The system's more compromised than I thought. We need to do this differently. I need you to abort the previous sequence and stand by for new instructions. Torres came back immediately, his voice fraying at the edges. We're at 7,000 feet and dropping. We don't have time for new instructions. You have exactly enough time if you execute perfectly. Trust me. Marcus glanced at Hayes. The commander's face was stone, but his eyes carried the weight of 4 lives hanging on the competence of a civilian consultant he'd met 10 minutes ago. Red Hawk 3, I need you to manually disengage your throttle control linkage. There's a red T-handle under the left side of your instrument panel. Pull it straight out until you feel it lock. That will decouple the engines from the automated power management system. Sullivan, if we pull that handle, we lose all automated engine response. We'll be controlling thrust manually during a control surface failure. I know. Do it anyway. You have 5 seconds. The telemetry feed showed engine power fluctuating wildly as the pilots wrestled with the decision. Then the power curve flattened into a steady line: manual control, no computer assistance, just human hands on physical throttles, adjusting fuel flow the way pilots had done it for 70 years before fly-by-wire systems existed. Handle is pulled. We're manual on engines. Good. Now input this sequence into your flight control panel. 4 Delta 9 Alpha Charlie 2. The Charlie 2 suffix will force a hard reset on both primary and secondary control loops simultaneously. You'll lose all flight control for approximately 3 seconds during the reboot. When the system comes back online, you'll have full manual authority, but during those 3 seconds the aircraft will do whatever physics tells it to do. You need to be wings level, nose slightly up, and holding steady altitude when you execute. Do you understand? Silence. Marcus could hear the pilots conferring in clipped, urgent tones. He couldn't make out the words, but he understood the subtext. 3 seconds of uncontrolled flight at 7,000 feet while fighting oscillating control surfaces was a roll of the dice weighted heavily toward catastrophe. Torres came back on. We understand. Preparing to execute. Wait for my mark. I'm watching your telemetry. I'll time it for a moment when the oscillations are at minimum amplitude. When I say execute, you input the code immediately, and then do not touch the controls until the system reboots. Let the aircraft fly itself for those 3 seconds. If you try to correct manually, you'll induce a spin. Marcus watched the oscillation pattern, waiting for the trough between peaks. The control surfaces were swinging through a sine wave of chaos, but there was a rhythm to it, a predictable frequency buried in the noise. He counted the intervals, timing the cycle, waiting for the optimal window. 5 seconds. 4. 3. Execute now. The telemetry feed went dark. For 3 seconds that stretched into subjective hours, Marcus stared at a blank screen while his imagination filled the void with images of a jet tumbling out of the sky, control surfaces locked in random positions, 4 men reaching for ejection handles. Then the data snapped back. Green lights cascaded across the diagnostic panel. Control surface position indicators showed neutral. Hydraulic pressure stabilized. Engine parameters steady. Altitude holding at 6,800 feet. Lieutenant Torres's voice came through the headset, shaking but functional. We have control. Repeat. We have full control. Surfaces responding normally. Jesus Christ, Sullivan, that was close. Hayes exhaled hard, the sound somewhere between relief and residual adrenaline. Marcus allowed himself a single moment of stillness before speaking again. Red Hawk 3. You're not clear yet. Your fuel state is critical. How much do you have left? A pause while the pilots checked their gauges. We're showing 4 minutes at current consumption, maybe less. Corpus Christi is your nearest suitable airfield. Distance approximately 6 minutes at best speed. The math was simple and unforgiving. The T-45 would run dry before reaching the runway. The pilots would have two options: ditch in the Gulf and hope the water landing didn't kill them, or push for the airfield and risk flaming out on final approach with no power for a go-around. Marcus pulled up a navigation overlay on the laptop screen, calculating distances and fuel burn rates. There was a narrow window. If the pilots climbed to optimize glide ratio and configured the aircraft for minimum drag, they could stretch the fuel by perhaps 30 seconds. Combined with a precision straight-in approach that eliminated any maneuvering, they might make it to the runway threshold with fumes in the tanks. Might. Red Hawk 3. I need you to climb to 10,000 feet immediately and configure for max endurance cruise. Retract speed brakes, set flaps to 0, and pull your throttles back to minimum sustainable power. You're going to fly a high-altitude, low-drag profile for as long as possible, then glide the last 2 miles if you have to. Sullivan, if we flame out short of the field, then you glide it in dead stick. The T-45 has a glide ratio of about 12-to-1. From 10,000 feet, you can cover 20 miles with no engines. Corpus Christi is 6 miles out. The numbers work if you fly it perfectly. Another pause. Marcus could feel the pilots doing their own calculations, weighing the risks of his plan against the certainty of ditching in open water. Roger. Climbing to 10,000, configuring for max endurance. The telemetry showed the T-45 clawing for altitude, trading airspeed for height, building potential energy like a bank account against the moment when the engines quit. Marcus watched the fuel gauge tick down with mechanical indifference. 3 minutes. 2:45. 2:30. Hayes leaned close, voice pitched low so the pilots wouldn't hear. If they flame out at altitude, can they really glide it in? If they're good, if the winds cooperate, if they don't make a single mistake on the approach. That's a lot of ifs. It's what we have. The Seahawk banked southeast, following the T-45's track toward Corpus Christi. Through the helicopter's open door, Marcus could see the coastline appearing on the horizon, a thin brown line separating gray water from pale sky. The weather was deteriorating. Clouds were building in stacked layers, and the wind had picked up, kicking whitecaps across the surface of the Gulf. Not a storm, but enough turbulence to make a dead-stick landing exponentially harder. The T-45 reached 10,000 feet and leveled off. Fuel remaining 90 seconds. Marcus keyed the radio. Corpus Christi Tower, this is Navy Seahawk 7 supporting Red Hawk 3. Be advised the T-45 is fuel critical and may require emergency dead-stick landing. Request you clear runway 18 and position all crash equipment. The tower controller responded immediately, his professionalism cracking just enough to let urgency bleed through. Hawk 7, runway 18 is clear. Crash crews are standing by. Red Hawk 3 is cleared for straight-in approach. No delay. Winds currently 270 at 18, gusting 25. Marcus relayed the wind information to the pilots. A direct crosswind at nearly 20 knots, gusting higher enough to push the aircraft off centerline during the final seconds of the approach when precision mattered most. Fuel remaining 60 seconds. The T-45 began its descent, trading the altitude it had just gained for distance toward the runway. Marcus pulled up the approach chart on the laptop and calculated the optimal glide path. The pilots needed to cross the runway threshold at exactly 200 feet speed, no less than 130 knots, lined up perfectly with the center line. Any deviation too high, too low, too fast, too slow would turn the landing into a controlled crash. Fuel remaining 30 seconds. Red Hawk 3, you're 2 miles from the field. I need you to configure for landing now. Gear down, flaps to full. You're going to feel a lot of drag when the gear extends, so be ready to push the nose down to maintain airspeed. Gear coming down. The telemetry showed the landing gear extending the additional drag, bleeding off 20 knots in the span of 5 seconds. The pilots compensated, lowering the nose, letting gravity do the work that the dying engines could no longer provide. Fuel remaining 15 seconds. 1 mile. You should have visual on the runway. Visual confirmed. We're lined up. Marcus watched the altitude and airspeed indicators, his mind calculating closure rates and descent angles. The T-45 was dropping through 800 feet, speed holding at 140, sink rate steady at 600 feet per minute. The numbers were good. Not perfect, but good enough. Fuel remaining 5 seconds. Both engines flamed out simultaneously. The telemetry feed showed fuel pressure dropping to 0, turbine RPM winding down, thrust falling off to nothing. The T-45 became a glider, its fate now governed entirely by the laws of physics and the skill of the pilots. Marcus heard Lieutenant Torres's voice, tight but controlled. "We're dead stick. Committed." The Seahawk circled the airfield at 1,500 feet, close enough for Marcus to see the T-45 through the open door. The jet was a gray speck against the darker gray of the Gulf, growing larger as it descended toward the runway threshold. The landing gear hung beneath the fuselage like the legs of a predatory bird, locked and ready. 500 feet, 400, 3. The wind shear hit at 200 feet. A brutal gust slammed into the T-45 from the left quarter and shoved it 20 feet right of centerline. Marcus saw the wings dip as the pilots fought to correct, using every ounce of remaining airspeed to wrestle the aircraft back onto the glide path. 100 feet. 50. The runway filled the windscreen. The T-45 crossed the threshold doing 130 knots, 10 knots faster than ideal, but within acceptable margins. The pilots flared, pulling the nose up, bleeding off speed, letting the main gears settle onto the concrete. The wheels touched with a screech of tortured rubber. The pilots deployed the drag chute, the bright orange canopy blossoming behind the tail, hauling the dead aircraft down through 100 knots, 80-60. And then the T-45 rolled to a stop 1,500 feet down the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles that had been chasing it since touchdown. The canopy popped open. 4 men climbed out onto the wing, their movements stiff but purposeful, alive, when the mathematics of fuel and distance had suggested they shouldn't be. Hayes clapped Marcus on the shoulder, the gesture heavy with unspoken gratitude. "You brought them home, Sullivan. Outstanding work." Marcus pulled off the headset and set it on the seat beside him. His hands were shaking, delayed reaction adrenaline draining out of his system now that the crisis had passed. He thought about Jake still at home with Mrs. Martinez, unaware that his father had just spent 40 minutes preventing 4 deaths. The boy would ask questions later when the story made the evening news, and Marcus would tell him a simplified version that stripped out the terror and focused on the problem-solving. The Seahawk landed at Corpus Christi Naval Air Station 10 minutes later. Marcus climbed out into bright sunlight and heat that hit like a physical wall after the climate-controlled cabin. A ground crew marshal waved them toward a parking spot near the operations building. Marcus walked across the tarmac, boots scuffing on concrete still warm from the morning sun, toward the 4 pilots who were standing in a cluster near their aircraft, talking with animation born of relief and residual shock. Lieutenant Torres spotted Marcus and broke away from the group. He was 28, lean and sunburned, with the kind of confidence that came from 6 years of flying high-performance jets, tempered by the fresh memory of nearly dying in one. He extended his hand. "Mr. Sullivan, we owe you our lives. That was the finest piece of remote technical support I've ever witnessed." Marcus shook the offered hand. "You did the hard part, Lieutenant. I just gave you the map." "With all respect, sir, that map was the difference between landing and swimming, or worse." The other 3 pilots approached a mix of ranks and experience levels, all sharing the same expression of grateful exhaustion. They introduced themselves, thanked him, asked questions about the technical details of the fix. Marcus answered briefly, keeping his explanations accessible, deflecting their gratitude with the ease of someone uncomfortable being the center of attention. A Navy public affairs officer appeared, flanked by 2 civilian reporters who had somehow gained access to the airfield. The questions started immediately, rapid fire and overlapping. "Mr. Sullivan, can you tell us what happened out there? How did you know how to fix the system? Is it true you used to work for Whitstone Aerospace? Marcus held up a hand, cutting off the cascade of inquiries. The aircraft experienced a flight control malfunction. The pilots executed a successful emergency landing. That's the story. Everything else is technical detail that doesn't belong in a news report. The public affairs officer, a lieutenant commander with the polished demeanor of someone trained to manage media crises, stepped forward smoothly. Gentlemen, we'll have a formal statement from Naval Air Systems Command within the hour. For now, I need to ask you to respect operational security and allow the crew to debrief. The reporters withdrew reluctantly, still shouting questions that Marcus ignored. He turned back to Lieutenant Torres. I need to make a phone call. Can you point me toward somewhere quiet? Torres gestured toward the operations building. Second floor conference room C. Should be empty this time of day. Marcus thanked him and walked toward the building, fishing his phone from his pocket. The screen showed 14 missed calls, 3 from Mrs. Martinez, 5 from numbers he didn't recognize, and 6 from Catherine Price. He ignored all of them and dialed Mrs. Martinez first. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with worry wrapped in forced calm. Marcus, thank God. We've been watching the news. Are you all right? I'm fine. How's Jake? He's good. Breathing normally, no distress. He's been asking where you are. I told him you had to help some people at work. Marcus closed his eyes and felt the tension in his chest ease fractionally. I'll be home in a few hours. Tell him I'm sorry I couldn't call sooner. He understands Marcus. He's a smart boy. He knows you're doing important work. They spoke for another minute, Mrs. Martinez filling him in on the mundane details of Jake's morning breakfast medication cartoons on the television. The normalcy of it felt surreal after the intensity of the rescue. Marcus thanked her, promised to be home before dinner, and ended the call. Then he stared at the 6 missed calls from Catherine Price. His first instinct was to delete them without listening to the voicemails. She had fired him. Whatever she wanted now was irrelevant to his immediate concerns. But curiosity won out over resentment. He tapped the voicemail icon and held the phone to his ear. Catherine's voice came through controlled but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been shame. Marcus, this is Catherine Price. I need to speak with you about what happened this morning. Please call me back as soon as possible. The second message was more direct. Marcus, I've disclosed the software flaw to the Department of Defense. I sent them your original report and the documentation showing that Whitstone ignored your recommendations. I need you to know that I'm taking full responsibility for the company's failure to act. Please call me. The third message was shorter, quieter. I'm sorry, for all of it. Marcus deleted the voicemails and pocketed the phone. Catherine's apology, sincere or otherwise, didn't change the mathematics of his situation. He was unemployed. He had a son with chronic medical needs and no health insurance. Whitstone's disclosure to the DoD meant there would be an investigation, lawsuits, probably criminal charges for the executives who had buried his report 6 years ago. Marcus would be called to testify, dragged through depositions and court appearances, his expertise weaponized in service of legal battles he wanted no part of. He had done his job. He had saved 4 lives. Now he needed to go home and figure out how to keep the electricity on and Jake's medication stocked while he searched for a new employer willing to hire a 39-year-old ex-Navy engineer with no recent references. A knock on the conference room door interrupted his thoughts. Commander Hayes stood in the doorway, his expression serious. "Sullivan, got a minute?" Marcus nodded. Hayes entered and closed the door behind him. "I just got off the phone with Rear Admiral Jennifer Chen at Naval Air Systems Command. She's overseeing the investigation into the T-45 fleet. She wants to meet with you." "When?" "Tomorrow morning. Pentagon. She's flying in from Patuxent River tonight." Marcus felt exhaustion settling into his bones like sediment. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that conversation, Commander. I left the Navy 5 years ago. My clearance is probably expired." "Your clearance was never revoked, just set to inactive status. And Admiral Chen specifically asked for you by name. She's read your original report on the flight control flaw. She wants your technical expertise for the investigation. What about Whitstone? They're going to have their own engineers providing testimony. Hayes's expression hardened. Whitstone's engineers are suspects in a potential criminal investigation for falsifying safety reports. Admiral Chen wants someone she can trust, someone who tried to stop this disaster before it happened. That's you, Sullivan. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, the reality of the situation crystallizing. The Navy wanted him back not as active duty, but as a civilian consultant embedded in an investigation that would likely end with indictments and multi-billion-dollar penalties. It was the right thing to do, the necessary thing. But it meant more time away from Jake, more hours spent in conference rooms and courtrooms instead of at school pickups and doctor's appointments. I have a son. He's 8. He has severe asthma. I can't be traveling to Maryland or Washington every week. Admiral Chen is aware of your situation. She's authorized remote work arrangements and flexible scheduling. You'd only need to be physically present for critical briefings and testimony. The rest can be handled via secure video conference. Marcus considered it. The work would pay well. Government consulting rates for someone with his expertise would solve his immediate financial problems. But it would also thrust him back into the world he had deliberately left behind, the world of classified briefings and Pentagon bureaucracy and decisions that affected thousands of lives. Tell Admiral Chen I'll meet with her, but I'm not making any commitments until I understand the full scope of what she's asking. Hayes nodded. Fair enough, I'll relay that. She'll have someone contact you with travel arrangements. The commander turned to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, Sullivan, you're the best damn engineer I've ever worked with. The Navy was lucky to have you. We're lucky you were willing to help today. Just doing what needed to be done. Hayes smiled faintly. That's what makes you valuable. Most people can't tell the difference between what needs to be done and what's convenient to do. You can. He left, closing the door behind him. Marcus stood alone in the conference room, staring out the window at the tarmac where the T-45 sat surrounded by maintenance crews and investigators. The aircraft looked small and fragile in the harsh Texas sunlight, its survival a testament to engineering margins and pilot skill, and the intervention of a fired maintenance technician who happened to know where the bodies were buried in the code. His phone buzzed. A text message from Catherine Price. Please let me apologize in person. I owe you that much. Marcus typed a response, deleted it, typed another. I'm not ready for that conversation. He hit send and powered off the phone. Whatever Catherine Price needed to say could wait. Right now, he needed to get back to Houston, back to the small house where Jake was waiting, back to the life he had built from the wreckage of the one he'd lost. The Navy could have him for an investigation. They could have his expertise, his testimony, his technical knowledge. But they couldn't have the hours between 3:15 and 8 o'clock in the evening, the sacred window when he picked Jake up from school, helped with homework, made dinner, and reminded his son that no matter what chaos erupted in the adult world, someone would always be there when he needed them. That promise was the only one Marcus would never break. 2 weeks had passed since the helicopter landed in Whitstone's parking lot, and Catherine Price sat in the Whitstone boardroom watching her career disintegrate in real time. The emergency session had been called for 8 in the morning, but the verdict had been decided long before she walked through the door. Thomas Brennan, the board chairman, didn't waste time on pleasantries. His 63 years sat heavy in the lines around his mouth, deeper now than they'd been at the start of the month. Stock down 31%, 2 major contracts suspended pending DoD review, 3 shareholder lawsuits filed as of yesterday morning. He paused, letting each number land like a body blow. Your decision to disclose the flight control flaw to the Department of Defense has cost this company $900 million in market capitalization. Catherine sat perfectly still, hands folded on the mahogany table. She'd known this was coming, had prepared for it during sleepless nights spent reviewing legal documents and worst-case scenarios, but knowing didn't soften the impact. That's speculation, Thomas. We could have handled it quietly, contained the damage. Victoria Hayes, the board member whose venture capital firm had pushed for Catherine's hiring 6 months ago, stopped herself mid-sentence. Even she couldn't finish defending the indefensible. 4 pilots almost died because we handled it quietly 6 years ago. Catherine's voice came out steady, clinical. The alternative to disclosure was waiting for the next incident, and the one after that. Eventually, someone would have died and the investigation would have uncovered everything. We'd be facing manslaughter charges instead of negligence. Brennan's expression didn't change. The board has voted. You're being removed as CEO effective immediately. We're offering you the CFO position. Take it or resign entirely. The words should have felt like a knife, but Catherine experienced something closer to vertigo, the ground dropping away beneath her feet, while simultaneously lifting a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. 6 months of ruthless efficiency metrics and quarterly earnings calls, and sacrificing people like Marcus Sullivan on the altar of punctuality. All of it gone in a single vote. "I'll take the CFO position," she heard herself say. "On one condition." Brennan's eyebrows climbed a fraction of an inch. Conditions from a deposed executive carried limited weight, but curiosity won out over dismissal. "When Marcus Sullivan comes back, if he comes back, he reports directly to this board, not to me or any other executive. Full authority to audit every program we're running. Power to halt any project he deems unsafe. No appeals, no overrides." The silence that followed carried the texture of disbelief. Victoria Hayes found her voice first. "You want us to give a fired maintenance technician veto power over billion-dollar programs. The optics alone. The optics of another dead crew are worse." Catherine met each board member's gaze in turn. "Marcus Sullivan tried to save lives 6 years ago when he was still serving his country. We ignored him. If we don't give him the authority to prevent the next disaster, we're just repeating the same mistake with different paperwork." Thomas Brennan leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The calculation happening behind his eyes was almost visible, weighing public perception against liability exposure, short-term stock price against long-term survival. "What makes you think he'll even come back?" "The man has every reason to walk away and never look at this company again." "I don't know if he will," Catherine admitted. "But if he does, it means he believes we can be better than our worst moments, and we need to prove him right." The vote took 3 minutes. 6 in favor, 2 opposed. Catherine Price became Chief Financial Officer of Whitstone Aerospace, reporting to a new CEO who would be announced within the week. Her corner office would go to someone else. Her executive assistant would be reassigned. The company parking spot with her name stenciled on the concrete would be painted over. But Marcus Sullivan would have the power to stop the next disaster before it started. Catherine left the boardroom and returned to her soon-to-be former office to collect personal items. 20 years of climbing corporate ladders, and she could fit the meaningful pieces into a single cardboard box. A photo of her parents, a commendation from her first job out of business school, a paperweight her ex-husband had given her before the marriage dissolved under the weight of conflicting ambitions. She picked up her phone and scrolled to Marcus Sullivan's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button for 30 seconds before she set the device down. A phone call wouldn't cut it. Some apologies required showing up in person, risking the door being slammed in your face, accepting the rejection you'd earned. Catherine checked her watch. 9:47 on a Friday evening. Late, but not unconscionably so. She had the address from his personnel file, a rental house in Kingwood, northeast of downtown Houston, the kind of neighborhood where working families raised kids and mowed lawns on Saturday mornings. The drive took 23 minutes. She parked across the street and sat in her car, rehearsing words that felt inadequate no matter how she arranged them. The house sat back from the curb behind a chain-link fence that needed paint. A single porch light illuminated concrete steps worn smooth by years of foot traffic. Through the front window, she could see warm yellow light and movement, a small figure passing through the living room. Jake, Marcus's 8-year-old son, the reason his father had been 7 minutes late to work. The reason Marcus had left the Navy. The reason for everything that mattered in a life Catherine had been too arrogant to consider before destroying it. She forced herself out of the car and walked to the front door. Knocked twice, the sound sharp in the evening stillness. The door opened. Jake stood there in pajamas printed with cartoon spacecraft, a library book about fighter jets tucked under one arm. His dark eyes widened with recognition, the pieces clicking together faster than most adults managed. "You're the lady who fired my dad." The words hit harder than Brennan's announcement in the boardroom. Catherine knelt, bringing herself to the boy's eye level, letting him see her face without the barrier of height and authority. "Yes, I am. And I came to tell you that I made a terrible mistake. I owe your father an apology I can never fully give, but I wanted him to hear it from me in person." Jake studied her with the unnervingly direct gaze of a child who'd learned early that adults lied more often than they told the truth. After a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable, he nodded. "Okay. He's in the kitchen. You can come in." The interior matched the exterior, clean but worn, furnished with pieces that had seen better decades. Framed photographs lined the walls. Marcus in his Navy uniform receiving a medal, his younger self standing straighter, less weathered by loss. A woman with thick dark hair holding an infant wrapped in a hospital blanket. Jake as a toddler on a swing set, his mother pushing him, her smile caught mid-laugh. The woman appeared in several photos, always touching Marcus or Jake with easy affection, the kind that came from love so deep it didn't require performance. Rebecca, the wife who'd died 5 years ago and left Marcus to navigate single fatherhood alone. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, dish towel in hand, surprise registering on his face before settling into something more guarded. He glanced at Jake, who had returned to the couch with his book, then gestured toward the kitchen table. They sat across from each other in mismatched chairs. Marcus poured coffee from a pot that looked older than his son's, sliding a chipped mug across the table. Catherine wrapped her hands around it, grateful for something to hold. "I fired you without asking a single question about why you were late. I saw a policy violation and made an example of you because I thought it would send a message about accountability. I was wrong. Profoundly, inexcusably wrong." Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. The kind of face you learned in the military, giving nothing away, waiting for orders or information before committing to a response. Catherine continued, "I've spent the past 2 weeks reviewing what happened in 2012. I read your original report, the one you filed while you were still serving. I read the emails where you escalated the issue to the program office. I saw how the previous executives ignored your warnings and implemented a patch instead of a proper fix." She paused, the weight of what came next pressing down on her lungs. "You tried to prevent this disaster. You did everything right. And they buried your work because it was inconvenient for the delivery schedule. Then I fired you for being 7 minutes late because your son almost stopped breathing in the middle of the night." Marcus took a sip of coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. "Why are you here, Ms. Price?" The question cut through the apology, demanding something more than words. Catherine had rehearsed this part, but the practiced speech dissolved under the directness of his gaze. "I want to offer you your job back. Not as a maintenance technician, as chief safety officer reporting directly to the board of directors. Full authority to audit every system we build. Power to halt any program you deem unsafe. No appeals, no overrides. 6-figure salary, comprehensive health benefits for you and Jake, and flexible scheduling that lets you prioritize your son however you need to." Marcus set down his mug carefully, the gesture precise. "That's generous, but it doesn't answer my question. Why are you here? You could have made that offer over the phone." Catherine looked down at her coffee, seeing her reflection distorted in the dark surface. The truth was harder to speak than the job offer, harder to admit than the mistakes she'd made. "Because I need to understand something. You protected Whitstone. You could have told the Navy investigators on the spot that we'd buried your report. Could have destroyed the company in a single press conference. But you didn't. Why?" Marcus leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "Because the people who made that decision 6 years ago don't work there anymore. The engineers on the floor, the technicians, the support staff, they're just trying to make a living and support their families. They didn't know about the cover-up. Destroying the company would have punished them for crimes they didn't commit." He met her eyes directly. "I learned in 14 years in the Navy that good leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room or the most ruthless. It's about protecting the people who depend on you, even when they'll never know you did it. Catherine felt something crack inside her chest, a fissure opening in the armor she'd spent 2 decades building. This man, this fired maintenance technician she'd dismissed as irrelevant, understood leadership in a way she'd never managed despite all her business school credentials and executive coaching. "I don't deserve your protection." "No," Marcus agreed, "but your employees do, and they deserve a leader who's learned from her mistakes." The statement carried no judgment, just a factual observation delivered with the same calm precision he'd used to guide 4 pilots through an emergency landing. Catherine found herself envying that quality, the ability to see past emotion to the core of what mattered. "The job offer stands, but I assume you have conditions beyond the title and salary." Marcus nodded. "I need to be able to pick Jake up from school every day at 3:15. No exceptions. If there's a meeting, a briefing, a crisis, it doesn't matter. I leave at 3. Done. And I need flexible scheduling for medical appointments and emergencies. Jake's asthma is unpredictable. I can't have another situation where bureaucracy keeps me from being there when he needs me. We'll implement a company-wide policy. Family emergencies get immediate approval, no layers, no delays. I'll draft it myself." Marcus hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "The salary, I want it structured as a trust fund for Jake's medical care and education. Guaranteed security that survives me if something happens." Catherine pulled out her phone and opened a notes app, typing as he spoke. The request revealed more about Marcus's priorities than any interview question ever could. Not wealth accumulation or status symbols, but protection for his son against an uncertain future. "Anything else?" "One more thing." Marcus's voice carried a different weight now, the careful deliberation of someone choosing words that would define the boundaries of a relationship. "I want Whitstone to establish a scholarship program for children of military families. $5 million annually administered by an independent foundation, named after my wife, the Sarah Sullivan Memorial Scholarship." The request caught Catherine off guard. She'd expected salary negotiations, benefit discussions, maybe demands related to his role and authority. Instead, Marcus was asking for something that would help strangers using his leverage to create a legacy for a woman who'd never know it existed. "I'll present it to the board Monday morning. They'll approve it. And a mentorship program pairing our engineers with veterans transitioning to civilian work. We hire a minimum of 50 veterans per year. Give them real jobs with real career paths, not token positions to check diversity boxes." Catherine kept typing. "Anything else?" "That's it. If you agree to those terms, I'll come back." She looked up from her phone. "I agree to all of it. Can you start Monday?" Marcus shook his head. "Tuesday. I have a meeting at the Pentagon Monday morning. Admiral Chen wants me to consult on the fleet-wide investigation." "The Navy wants you back." "As a contractor, not active duty. I'll work with them remotely, testify when needed, but I'm not leaving Houston. Jake needs stability more than I need a uniform." Catherine saved her notes and pocketed the phone. She stood extending her hand across the table. Marcus rose and shook it, the gesture formal and final. "Thank you, Marcus. For the second chance you didn't have to give me. Don't thank me. Earn it." The words were delivered without rancor, but with absolute clarity. Catherine had been granted an opportunity to prove that her transformation was genuine, not performance art designed to salvage her career. The measurement would be in actions, not apologies. She turned to leave, then paused at the kitchen door. "One more thing. The board asked me this afternoon if I thought you'd come back. I told them I didn't know, but that if you did, it would mean you believed Whitstone could be better than its worst moments. Was I right?" Marcus considered the question, his gaze drifting toward the living room where Jake had fallen asleep on the couch, the book about fighter jets still open on his chest. "I believe people can be better than their worst moments. Companies are just collections of people. So yes, you were right." Catherine nodded and let herself out. She drove back toward Houston in silence, the radio off, alone with the magnitude of what she'd set in motion. Bringing Marcus back would send a signal to the workforce that competence and integrity mattered more than political maneuvering. But it would also mean surrendering a degree of control she'd never given to anyone in her professional life. Marcus would have the authority to overrule her, to halt projects she championed, to force decisions that damaged quarterly earnings in service of long-term safety. That was the price of trust. And after 2 weeks of watching Whitstone's reputation hemorrhage in real time, Catherine understood that trust was the only currency that mattered. The Pentagon meeting took place in a windowless conference room on the 3rd floor of the E-Ring, the outermost corridor of the massive 5-sided structure that housed the Department of Defense leadership. Marcus arrived 30 minutes early, cleared security, and waited in a lobby decorated with black and white photographs of aircraft carriers and strategic bombers. At precisely 800 hours, a Navy lieutenant appeared and escorted him through corridors that smelled of fresh paint and institutional coffee. The conference room seated 12, but only 4 chairs were occupied. Rear Admiral Jennifer Chen was 52, compact and precise, with the kind of presence that made junior officers stand straighter without her saying a word. She'd spent 30 years in naval aviation flying F/A-18S off carriers before transitioning to acquisition and program management. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp with the intelligence of someone who'd survived Pentagon politics without compromising her principles. "Mr. Sullivan, thank you for coming. I've read your file. Impressive career. The Navy's loss when you separated. I had priorities that didn't fit with active duty, ma'am. Your son, I understand. Please take a seat." Also present DoD General Counsel James Kozlowski and Dr. Patricia Vance, lead engineer at Naval Air Systems Command. A stack of classified folders sat in the center of the table, each marked with red cover sheets indicating their security status. Chen opened the meeting without preamble. "We've completed preliminary analysis of the T-45 fleet. Your assessment was correct. The secondary flight control flaw exists in all 47 aircraft currently equipped with Whitstone modules." She slid a folder across the table. Marcus opened it to find incident reports, maintenance logs, and telemetry data from a dozen flights where pilots had experienced unexplained control surface oscillations. Each incident had been investigated, documented, and filed away with explanations that attributed the problem to everything except the actual cause. "We missed it." Chen continued, her voice carrying the weight of institutional failure. "Our engineers, our test pilots, our safety review boards, everyone missed it because Whitstone told us it was fixed, and we believed them." Kozlowski, the DoD lawyer, cleared his throat. "Mr. Sullivan, we need to establish timeline and culpability. You filed a formal report with the Navy 6 years ago while you were still on active duty identifying this exact flaw. You recommended a complete redesign of the affected module. What happened next?" Marcus walked them through the sequence. His initial discovery during simulation exercises when he was still serving as a warrant officer. The formal report submitted through the contractor liaison channel. The recommendation for a 6-month delay to implement proper fixes. And the decision made by Whitstone's previous executive team to override his technical judgment in favor of a software patch that masked symptoms without addressing root causes. "Did you report this to the Navy at the time?" "Yes. I submitted a copy of my findings to the program office through the contractor reporting channel. I was told Whitstone would handle the remediation and provide documentation when the fix was complete." Dr. Vance leaned forward, her expression tight. "We have that report in our archives. Whitstone submitted a corrective action plan claiming they'd implemented your recommended fixes. The documentation showed successful test results. We approved it and closed the issue." "The test results were fabricated," Marcus replied, keeping his voice level. "They ran the tests with the patch in place, which made the system appear functional under controlled conditions. But the underlying flaw remained in the code." Kozlowski made notes on a legal pad, his pen scratching across paper with mechanical precision. "Did you know at the time that Whitstone had falsified the test data?" "No. I left the Navy 6 months after submitting my report. My wife had terminal cancer. I assumed the work had been done properly." "Why did you leave?" Marcus met the lawyer's eyes. "My wife died. My son needed me more than the Navy did." The room went quiet. Chen broke the silence. "Mr. Sullivan, we need your help investigating this." Not just the technical aspects, we have engineers who can reverse engineer the code. We need someone who understands how this kind of institutional failure happens, how to prevent it from happening again. You want me to help redesign the contractor oversight framework. More than that, we want you to help us rebuild it from the ground up. This isn't a 6-month contract reviewing code. It's years of work building new processes, training Navy engineers to ask harder questions, creating accountability mechanisms that can't be circumvented by companies desperate to meet deadlines. Marcus considered the scope of what she was describing. It wasn't a consulting gig. It was a fundamental restructuring of how the Navy worked with defense contractors, a commitment that would consume thousands of hours over multiple years. I have conditions. Chen smiled faintly. I expected you would. Let's hear them. All work has to be remote except for critical meetings. I'm based in Houston and I'm not relocating. My son's medical needs require stability. Acceptable. Secure video conferencing can handle most collaboration. I need flexible scheduling. If my son has a medical emergency, I drop everything. No exceptions. Understood. We'll build that into the contract. And I want authority to escalate safety concerns directly to you, bypassing program offices and acquisition bureaucracy. If I find something wrong, you need to hear about it immediately, not after it's been filtered through layers of management. Chen didn't hesitate. Done. Anything else? Marcus thought about the offer Catherine had made 3 days ago, the job at Whitstone with its salary and benefits and promise of redemption. The Navy work would run parallel to that, 2 separate streams of responsibility that would consume every hour he wasn't spending with Jake. It was sustainable if he was ruthless about boundaries, impossible if he let either commitment bleed into family time. I need the contract to specify that I'm unavailable between 1,500 and 2,000 hours daily. Those hours are non-negotiable. Kozlowski raised an eyebrow. That's a significant restriction for someone in a consulting role. That's my price. If it's not acceptable, we can end this conversation now. Chen held up a hand forestalling the lawyer's objection. Mr. Sullivan, can I ask why those specific hours? Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the weight of a promise made at a hospital bedside 5 years ago. I pick my son up from school at 15:15. We have dinner together. I help with homework. We spend time together. Those hours are the promise I made to him when his mother died. I don't break promises to my son. The Admiral studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. I have 3 kids. 2 of them barely remember me from their childhood because I was too busy being a naval officer to be a parent. I respect your priorities, Mr. Sullivan. We'll structure the contract around your requirements. She turned to Kozlowski. Make it happen. Marcus left the Pentagon carrying a folder full of classified material and the weight of 2 separate commitments that would define the next several years of his life. He caught a flight back to Houston that afternoon, landing at Bush Intercontinental at 17:30 too late to pick Jake up from the after-school program, but early enough to make dinner. Mrs. Martinez met him at the door with Jake in tow, the boy's backpack dragging on the ground behind him. Her dark eyes swept over Marcus with practiced assessment. How was Washington? Productive. Thank you for watching him. Always a pleasure. He's been talking about you all day. Wants to know if you saw the president. Jake's face lit up as he spotted his father. He ran forward and wrapped his arms around Marcus's waist, the kind of full-body hug that 8-year-olds gave when they'd been worried longer than they wanted to admit. Did you see him? Dad? Did you see the president? Marcus knelt, bringing himself to Jake's eye level. Different building, buddy. The president works in the White House. I was at the Pentagon. That's where the military plans how to keep people safe. Like the airplane you fixed the other day. Exactly like that. Jake's expression grew serious, the question forming before the words came out. Are you going back to being in the Navy? Marcus saw the fear in his son's eyes, the primal terror of a child who'd lost his mother and now faced the possibility of losing daily contact with his father, even to something as abstract as a job. He smoothed Jake's hair, the gesture automatic. No. I'm staying here with you. I'm just helping them from Houston. I'll still pick you up from school every day." Relief washed across Jake's face, visible and raw. The boy's fingers tightened around Marcus's hand. "Promise?" "Promise." They spent the evening in comfortable routine. Dinner, homework. Jake struggling with fractions until Marcus showed him a trick for visualization. Bath time, story time, lights out at 2000 sharp. Marcus returned to the kitchen table and opened his laptop, reviewing notes from the day's work at the Pentagon. The classified material couldn't leave the secure facility, but he had taken extensive notes on unclassified aspects of the investigation. He opened a document and began outlining a framework for contractor oversight that would make it harder for companies to bury safety concerns. The work was technical and tedious, requiring him to think through failure modes and accountability mechanisms. But it had the virtue of being solvable. Unlike grief, unlike asthma, unlike the uncertainty of single parenthood, this was a problem with defined parameters and achievable solutions. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine Price Board. Approved everything. Scholarship fund, veteran hiring program, all of it. See you Tuesday. Marcus typed a response. Tuesday, 0800. He set the phone aside and returned to his outline, working until midnight before exhaustion finally forced him to stop. Tomorrow, he would take Jake to the doctor for a routine checkup, spend the afternoon at the park. If the boy's breathing held steady, maybe grill burgers for dinner. The ordinary tasks of fatherhood that anchored him when the larger world threatened to become overwhelming. Marcus Sullivan had saved 4 lives, exposed corporate corruption, and accepted 2 separate roles that would consume thousands of hours over the next several years. But the achievement he measured himself against had nothing to do with airplanes or investigations or career advancement. It was simpler and harder being present when Jake needed him, keeping promises, choosing love over ambition every single time the choice presented itself. Everything else was just engineering. Tuesday morning arrived with cloudless skies and humidity thick enough to taste. Marcus drove to Whitstone Aerospace in pre-dawn darkness, arriving at the facility gate at 7:45. The security guard checked his new credentials, a badge listing his title as Chief Safety Officer, and waved him through with a nod that carried more respect than Marcus had received in 2 years of working maintenance. The executive wing was quiet. Marcus found his new office on the 3rd floor, a corner space with windows overlooking the flight line, where retired aircraft sat in various stages of refurbishment. The furniture was new, the computer equipment current, the walls bare except for a framed copy of the company's safety policy that someone had hung with bureaucratic optimism. Catherine appeared in the doorway at 7:58 carrying 2 cups of coffee. She'd traded the CEO's tailored suits for something slightly less severe, though her posture still carried the tension of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. "Thought you might need this." Marcus accepted the cup and gestured to the empty office. "Feels strange being up here instead of on the floor." "You'll get used to it, or you won't. Either way, your value isn't in where you sit, it's in what you prevent." She handed him a folder thick with documentation. "Complete audit access to every program we're running. Safety review authority over all government contracts. Direct reporting line to me and the board. You're empowered to halt any project if you identify safety concerns. No appeals, no overrides." Marcus flipped through the folder, scanning organizational charts and policy documents. "This is going to make me extremely unpopular with program managers." "Good. Popularity is a luxury we can't afford. I need someone willing to stop disasters before they happen, not someone worried about making friends." She sat in one of the visitor chairs, her posture less rigid than it had been 2 weeks ago, some of the armor stripped away by crisis and consequence. "The board wants regular updates on your findings, monthly reports, quarterly presentations. They're terrified of another T-45 situation." "They should be. We got lucky this time. 4 pilots who flew perfectly. Weather that held, fuel that stretched just far enough. Next time we might not be lucky." "That's why you're here, to make sure there isn't a next time." Marcus set down the folder. "I'm going to find things you don't want to find. Shortcuts cost overruns disguised as efficiency measures, testing protocols that look rigorous on paper, but miss critical failure modes. When I do, I'm going to report them even if it costs the company money, even if it damages relationships with clients. Are you prepared for that? Catherine met his gaze without flinching. If I wasn't prepared for it, I wouldn't have hired you. Do what needs to be done, Marcus. I'll handle the consequences. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. The scholarship fund launches next month. First class of recipients will be 15 students, children of active duty and veteran families. The foundation wants you to speak at the award ceremony. Are you willing? Marcus thought about Sarah, who'd never meet the students whose education would be funded in her name, who'd never know that her husband had turned personal tragedy into something that would outlive them both. I'll speak, but keep it brief. I'm not good at public events. Noted. Ceremony's scheduled for 1500 on the 23rd. That gives you time to pick up Jake first. Catherine left him alone in the office that represented his resurrection from obscurity. Marcus spent the morning reviewing program files, flagging items that required deeper investigation, building a list of engineers he wanted to interview about testing protocols and safety culture. The work was familiar, not identical to what he'd done in the Navy, but close enough that muscle memory carried him through the learning curve. At 14:45, he saved his files and shut down his computer. By 1500, he was in his truck heading toward Jake's school. He arrived at 1512, parked in the pickup lane, and watched the doors for his son's small figure. Jake emerged at 15:15, exactly, backpack bouncing, talking animatedly with another boy about something that involved hand gestures mimicking explosions. He spotted Marcus's truck and sprinted over, yanking open the door and climbing into the back seat with the kind of energy only 8-year-olds possessed. Dad, we learned about the solar system today. Did you know Jupiter has 79 moons? They drove home discussing planetary science, Jake's questions tumbling out faster than Marcus could answer them. The boy's enthusiasm was a reminder that wonder still existed in a world that often felt exhausted by its own complexity. Mrs. Martinez had left dinner prep on the counter, marinated chicken and vegetables ready for the grill. Marcus changed out of his work clothes and spent an hour in the backyard teaching Jake how to identify constellations while the charcoal heated. After dinner came homework. Jake struggled with long division, his frustration building until Marcus showed him a trick for visualizing the process. The boy's face lit up with comprehension, that moment of connection when confusion crystallized into understanding. It was the same satisfaction Marcus felt solving engineering problems, just applied to simpler mathematics. Bath time. Story time. Lights out at 2000. Marcus returned to the kitchen table and opened his laptop, reviewing notes from the day's work at Whitstone. He found 3 programs with testing protocols that concerned him, not flagrant violations, but subtle erosions of safety margins dressed up in language about efficiency and optimization. He drafted emails to the relevant program managers requesting detailed documentation and scheduling review meetings. His phone buzzed with a message from Admiral Chen: contract finalized. Check your email for secure file transfer instructions. First deliverable due in 30 days. Marcus pulled up his email and found the classified transfer portal. He downloaded the initial briefing materials, technical specifications for the T-45 fleet audit, organizational charts showing Navy acquisition hierarchy, preliminary findings from the investigation into Whitstone's testing falsification. The scope was massive. 47 aircraft to audit hundreds of components, to verify thousands of test results, to cross-check against actual performance data. It would consume every evening hour he could spare every weekend morning before Jake woke up, every fragment of time not dedicated to fatherhood or his job at Whitstone. Marcus had rebuilt his life around the principle that some promises couldn't be broken. He'd left the Navy to keep his promise to Sarah, raise their son with presence and intention. He'd taken a low-level job to keep his promise to Jake. Stability mattered more than ambition. And now he was making a new promise to the pilots who trusted their lives to equipment built by companies that sometimes chose convenience over safety. It was a lot of promises, maybe too many for one person to keep. But Marcus had learned in the aftermath of loss that the only way to honor the dead was to protect the living. Sarah was gone. The best he could do was make sure other families didn't experience the same sudden, senseless grief. He worked until midnight, took a shower, checked on Jake one final time, and fell into bed exhausted. Tomorrow would bring more program reviews, more emails, more meetings with engineers who'd been cutting corners so long they'd forgotten what the margins were for. The work would never be finished. There would always be another flaw to find, another disaster to prevent another executive choosing quarterly earnings over long-term safety. But somewhere in the darkness over the Gulf of Mexico, 4 pilots were sleeping in their own beds because Marcus Sullivan had chosen to care when it would have been easier not to. That was the only measurement that mattered. 3 months passed. Whitstone had transformed from a company racing toward profit margins into an organization that understood survival required trust. The change was imperfect, incomplete, resisted by managers who preferred the old metrics. But it was real, measured not in press releases or stock rebounds, but in the quiet accumulation of decisions that prioritized safety over convenience. Marcus had halted 2 programs for safety reviews. Both program managers had been furious, but the board backed his calls. Stock price was recovering slowly, up 18% from the lowest point. A new DoD contract had been awarded, smaller than before, but it was a start. Catherine, now CFO, worked harder than she had as CEO. She reported to a new chief executive hired from outside, a man with a reputation for building safety cultures at troubled aerospace firms. But she also seemed lighter somehow, as if shedding the corner office had lifted a burden she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The Sarah Sullivan Memorial Scholarship launch event filled a hotel ballroom with 200 attendees. 15 students sat on stage with their families, children of active duty personnel and veterans, their faces carrying the same mix of pride and uncertainty that came with being singled out for recognition. Marcus stood at the podium, uncomfortable, in a suit and tie, with Jake sitting in the front row next to Mrs. Martinez. He kept his remarks brief as promised. My wife Sarah believed that service to country was the highest calling. She supported my Navy career even when it meant sacrifice. When she got sick, I had to choose between career and family. I chose family. She would have understood that choice, and she would have been proud that her name now helps families who make similar sacrifices. He paused, meeting the eyes of the students on stage. To the scholarship recipients, your parents serve so we can sleep safely. This scholarship is a small thank you for their service and your sacrifice. Applause filled the ballroom. Marcus stepped down from the podium and Jake ran up to hug him. Catherine watched from the back of the room, wiping her eyes. The moment represented full redemption, not through corporate success, but through a legacy of care that would outlive quarterly reports and stock prices. 6 months after the helicopter landing, Marcus's routine had solidified into a rhythm that worked. 700 to 1500 Whitstone, 15:15 pick up Jake, 15:30 to 2000 homework dinner family time, 2000 to midnight, 2 or 3 nights a week, Navy investigation work. Tonight Marcus and Jake sat in the backyard under stars just beginning to appear in the Houston sky. Marcus was teaching his son about constellations, pointing out patterns in the darkness. Jake's question came quietly. Dad, do you ever miss being in the Navy? Marcus considered the question carefully, aware that his answer would shape how his son understood sacrifice and choice. Sometimes I miss the work, the challenge of solving hard problems, but I don't miss being away from you, not for a second. Is that why you didn't go back when the helicopter came? I did go back, buddy, just in a different way. I helped the Navy from here, but I come home to you every night. Jake thought about this, processing the nuance. Because you promised Mom. Marcus felt his throat tighten. Because I promised Mom, and because I promise you. You're the most important thing in my life, Jake. Nothing changes that. Jake hugged him, the simple gesture carrying more weight than any award or promotion. I know, Dad. You always keep your promises. Marcus's phone buzzed. An email from Admiral Chen. Subject: T-45 Fleet Audit complete. All aircraft cleared. Body. Mr. Sullivan, thanks to your protocols, we've identified and corrected the flaw across the entire fleet. 0 incidents since implementation. You've saved countless lives we'll never count. The Navy thanks you. Marcus read it, felt the weight lift. The work wasn't done, would never be completely done, but this particular promise was kept. 4 pilots saved 6 months ago, an entire fleet protected going forward. Other families spared the sudden grief that Sarah's death had brought. He deleted the email and pocketed the phone, returning his attention to Jake. Now that bright star there, that's actually a planet. Can you guess which one? Jake squinted at the sky. Venus. Marcus smiled. That's my boy. The measure of a person isn't found in titles or accolades, but in what they choose to protect when no one's watching. Marcus had lost his wife to circumstances beyond his control, but he'd kept his promise to her by raising their son with unwavering commitment that turned tragedy into purpose. In doing so, he'd accidentally taught a CEO, a Navy admiral, and 4 grateful pilots that the clock is never more important than the person it measures. Some people spend their entire lives searching for purpose. Marcus Sullivan found his at 4 in the morning in a pediatric emergency room, holding his son's hand while machines measured breathing. Everything that came after the rescue, the investigation, the redemption, was just implementation detail. The only truth that mattered fit in a single sentence: a father keeps his promises.